The shot rang out across the lane just after 11. The sound split the January fog like a crack in glass, and somewhere in the dark a man fell forward into the mud without a word. His bucket clattered beside him, spilling tools into the frozen rut. Francis Smith stood 10 paces back, the pistol still warm in his hand, smoke curling into the cold air. He did not move, he did not speak. Around him the silence returned, thick and wet, pressing against the shuttered houses of Black Lion Lane. Somewhere a dog began to bark, somewhere a candle flared behind a window. But Smith only stared at the shape crumpled in the road, the white garment pale against the earth, and felt the first cold weight of understanding settle into his chest. He had been hunting a ghost. He had found a man. The year was 1804, and in the parish of Hammersmith, fear had taken root so deeply that reason had withered beneath it. For weeks the streets had emptied at dusk, doors had been locked, women had wept, and now, in the wake of one terrified pull of a trigger, the line between superstition and murder had been crossed in the dark. Chapter 1. The First Sightings. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, the world has softened into shadow. And somewhere beyond your window, the hours are slipping past. Perhaps you are listening in the stillness of your room, or in the glow of a lamp turned low. Wherever you are, whatever the hour, you have found your way here, to this small corner of the past, where the forgotten stories wait. I wonder where you are tonight. Are you in London, where these events unfolded 2 centuries ago? Are you across the ocean in another country entirely, listening as the clock moves toward midnight? Or perhaps it is already morning where you are, and you're using this voice to ease yourself back into sleep after waking too early. Whatever the time, whatever the place, you are welcome here. Take a breath, let the day fall away. Tonight we travel back across 2 centuries to the cold streets of Georgian London, to a place where fear took root so deeply that it turned neighbour against neighbour, and where one winter night a man with a gun mistook the living for the dead. This is the story of the Hammersmith ghost, a phantom that haunted the lanes of West London and left behind not mystery but blood. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, I invite you to do so now. It helps more than you know, and it ensures these stories continue to be told. And if you find comfort in these tales from the shadows of history, please leave a word below telling me where you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I read them all, everyone, and I'm grateful for your presence here. Now, let us begin. Let us step backward into the fog. The parish of Hammersmith lay along the Thames, west of the great sprawl of the city, where the road still turned to mud in winter, and the houses pressed close together, under slate and thatch. It was a place of labourers and tradesmen, of bricklayers and washerwomen, of narrow lanes that twisted between churchyards and common land. The river ran past its southern edge, carrying barges and wherries toward the heart of London, and the roads that led eastward were crowded each morning with workers making their way to the docks and factories. But Hammersmith itself remained a place apart, neither fully urban nor truly rural, a parish caught between the old world of fields and hedgerows and the new world of brick and smoke. The year was 1803, and autumn had come late and cold. The leaves fell brown from the elms that lined the common. The river ran grey beneath low skies, the water thick and sluggish. Frost came early to the rooftops, and in the final weeks of October the first stories began to circulate. They came in whispers at first, traded across market stalls and alehouses, the kind of talk that might have been dismissed as fancy or drink. But the whispers did not fade. They grew. A woman walking home from her sister's house claimed she had seen a figure in the churchyard of St. Paul's, tall and pale, wrapped in white. She said it had stood among the graves without moving, and when she called out thinking it might be someone in need of help, it had turned toward her with a face she could not describe. Not because it was monstrous, she told her neighbours later, but because it seemed to have no features at all, only a blankness, a void where a face should have been. She ran. She did not look back. When she reached her door, she bolted it behind her and sat trembling in the dark until her husband came home. She was not a foolish woman. She was not given to hysteria. But she swore on her life that what she had seen was not of this world. Others followed. A man returning from work near Black Lion Lane said he had passed a shape on the road, something that glided rather than walked, something that made no sound. He swore it had no feet, that the white garment it wore fell to the ground and obscured whatever lay beneath. He had stopped and called out, but the figure had not replied. It had simply continued moving, drifting past him with a slowness that felt unnatural, deliberate, as if time itself moved differently around it. He did not follow. He went home and told his wife, and his wife told the women at the market, and the story spread. A servant girl fainted in the street after encountering what she called a spectre near the common, and when she woke she could not stop shaking. Her mistress had to put her to bed with hot bricks and brandy. The girl would not say what she had seen, only that it had looked at her and that she had felt certain, absolutely certain, that she was going to die. The stories accumulated like frost on a window pane, each one adding another layer to the cold. By November, the figure had been seen a dozen times, perhaps more. The accounts came from different people who did not know one another, who lived in different parts of the parish, who had no reason to collaborate in a hoax. They described the same thing, always. A tall figure, far taller than a man, dressed in white, though whether in a shroud or a sheet or some garment of the grave, none could say with certainty. Its face was pale, some said luminous, glowing faintly in the dark like foxfire on a rotting log. Others said the face was hidden, veiled, or simply absent. It did not speak, it did not respond when spoken to, and it vanished always before anyone could approach closely. Sometimes it seemed to dissolve into the shadows, other times it simply turned a corner and was gone, leaving nothing behind but the memory of cold and the smell of earth. The descriptions were vague, but the fear was precise. This was no trick of the light. This was no wandering beggar or harmless madman dressed in stolen linen. This was something else, something that did not belong to the world of the living. The people of Hammersmith were not strangers to superstition. They lived in an age where the line between the natural and the supernatural remained thin, porous, a boundary that could be crossed in either direction. Ghost stories were told as truth. Omens were read in the flight of birds, in the howling of dogs, in the sudden extinguishing of candles. The city's graveyards were crowded with the dead, layered deep in the clay, and the smell of decay was never far away. Disease moved freely through the tenements. Consumption hollowed out entire families. Fever took children in the night. Death was commonplace, familiar, expected. But a walking corpse, a spirit returned from the grave to wander among the living, that was something older, something that reached back into the darkest fears of childhood and faith. That was the kind of thing that should not happen, and yet it was happening. The fear spread, carried from house to house like contagion. Mothers kept their children indoors after sunset, drawing the curtains tight and warning them not to look out into the dark. Men hurried home before the light failed, their tools clattering on their shoulders, their eyes darting toward every shadow. Women refused to walk alone, and those who had no choice moved quickly, clutching shawls around their faces, murmuring prayers under their breath. The lanes that had once been busy with evening traffic grew empty. Shutters closed early. Candles were snuffed as soon as the household went to bed because light might draw attention, and no one wanted to be noticed by whatever walked the streets after dark. The parish slowly began to hold its breath. Life continued because it had to. Work did not stop. Bread still had to be baked, clothes still had to be washed, children still had to be fed. But everything took on a new quality, a tension that thrummed just beneath the surface. People spoke in lower voices, they looked over their shoulders, they listened for footsteps that were not there. There were those who scoffed, of course. There were always skeptics, men who insisted the ghost was nothing more than imagination fed by darkness and rumour. They pointed out that no one had been harmed. They argued that the figure, if it existed at all, was likely just a prankster, some bored young man playing a cruel joke on his neighbours. They said the stories had been exaggerated in the telling, that what began as a glimpse of a white coat in the fog had grown into a supernatural visitation through sheer repetition. But their voices grew quieter as the weeks passed, because the sightings continued, and because the encounters grew bolder, more direct, more impossible to dismiss. In mid-November, a woman named Mrs. Millwood was walking near the churchyard when she saw the figure standing directly in her path. She stopped. The figure did not move. She called out, her voice sharp and frightened, demanding to know who it was, what it wanted. The figure raised one arm slowly, as if in greeting or warning. The movement was smooth, too smooth, lacking the jerkiness of human motion. Mrs. Millwood screamed. She turned and ran, her skirts tangling around her legs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she reached her home, she collapsed in the doorway, sobbing so hard she could not speak. Her husband found her there and carried her inside. She would not leave the house for a week. When she finally did, she carried a Bible with her, clutched tight against her chest. Another man, a wagoner named William Girdler, was driving his cart along the Hammersmith road when he saw the ghost standing in the middle of the lane. His horse saw it first. The animal reared back, eyes rolling white, hooves striking the air. Girdler pulled the reins hard, cursing, trying to bring the horse under control. The ghost turned its face toward him. Girdler later said the face was white as bone, that the eyes were hollow, not empty, but filled with something that looked like shadow, like the darkness at the bottom of a well. He felt a cold pass through him that had nothing to do with the wind, a cold that started in his chest and spread outward to his fingertips. He whipped the horse forward, shouting, and the cart lurched past the figure. He did not stop until he reached the next village. When he arrived, he was shaking so hard he could barely hold the reins. He went into the first alehouse he found and drank until he could no longer remember the hollow eyes. By December, the stories had reached the London newspapers. The Morning Post carried an account under the heading, "The Hammersmith Ghost," describing the figure as a restless spirit that had been seen by dozens of respectable witnesses. The article treated the matter with a mixture of curiosity and caution, neither fully endorsing nor dismissing the claims. It noted that the parish was in a state of considerable alarm, that women were refusing to venture out after dark, and that several people had suffered ill effects from their encounters with the apparition. The piece concluded by wondering whether the figure might be the spirit of someone who died violently or unjustly, seeking some form of redress or vengeance. But the effect of the article was immediate and unintended. The ghost became famous. People from other parishes began to travel to Hammersmith at dusk, hoping for a glimpse. Some came with lanterns and notebooks, treating the matter as a curiosity, an entertainment. Others came with prayers and holy water, hoping to lay the spirit to rest. A few came with weapons, clubs, and knives hidden beneath their coats. The parish, already frightened, became a spectacle, and the figure, whatever it was, continued to appear. The winter deepened. The Thames froze at the edges, thin sheets of ice forming along the banks. The nights grew longer and colder, and the darkness pressed closer against the windows. The ghost was seen again near the churchyard, standing among the headstones like one more monument to the dead. It was seen on the footpath near the common, moving slowly through the bare trees. It was seen standing in the lane outside a tavern, motionless, watching the door as if waiting for someone to emerge. A pregnant woman encountered it near her home and went into early labour from the shock. The child was stillborn. Another woman, elderly and frail, saw the figure and collapsed in the street. Neighbours carried her inside, but she never fully recovered. She died 3 days later, her last words a fevered whisper about the white shape with no face. The deaths were not attributed to the ghost directly. The midwife said the baby had been positioned wrong. The physician said the old woman's heart had simply given out. But the connection was made nonetheless, whispered in kitchens and workshops. The thing in white was not merely frightening. It was dangerous. It was killing people. The mood in Hammersmith turned from fear to anger. Men gathered in the alehouses and spoke in low, serious tones about what needed to be done. Something had to be done. The constables were no help. They had no authority over spirits and little interest in chasing shadows through the dark. The clergy offered prayers, masses for the dead, exorcisms muttered over doorways and graves, but prayers did not stop the sightings. The ghost walked on, and so a group of men, tradesmen and labourers, ordinary men with families and debts and calloused hands, decided to take matters into their own hands. They would patrol the lanes, they would arm themselves, they would hunt the ghost, and if it could be caught, they would drag it into the light and prove it for what it was, man or devil, flesh or phantom. Among them was a man named Francis Smith, an excise officer, a man of steady reputation and sober habits. He owned a pistol, he knew how to use it, and on the night of January the 3rd, 1804, he took his place in the shadows of Black Lion Lane, waiting for the ghost to come. The chapter closes here. The streets empty and font, the lanterns burning low behind shuttered windows. Somewhere in the dark something is moving, and somewhere a man stands with a loaded gun, his breath misting in the cold, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The night holds its breath. The hunt has begun. Chapter 2. The Shape in White. The figure had been seen so many times by the first week of January that the witnesses had begun to speak of it as if it were a person, a neighbour, someone who lived among them. They did not say a ghost was seen, they said it was seen again. They said it appeared near the lane. They said it walked past the churchyard. The language had shifted. The thing had become familiar, and familiarity, instead of lessening the fear, had deepened it. Because the figure did not behave as ghosts were supposed to behave. It did not vanish when approached. It did not appear only at midnight or in places touched by tragedy. It walked the same streets the living walked. It moved through the same spaces, and the longer it remained, the more it seemed to belong to Hammersmith, as if it had claimed the parish for itself and would not be driven out. The descriptions that came from the witnesses were remarkably consistent. It stood between 6 and 7 feet tall, though some said it seemed even taller when it moved, as if it stretched itself upward in the dark. It was dressed entirely in white, a garment that fell from its shoulders to the ground in loose flowing folds. Some said it looked like a shroud, the kind of cloth used to wrap the dead before they were placed in the earth. Others said it resembled a sheet, the sort hung on a line to dry, but worn like a cloak or robe. A few witnesses insisted it was more elaborate, a gown or vestments of some kind, with sleeves that hung past the hands and a hood that obscured the head. But all agreed on the colour: white, bone white, luminous in the dark, glowing faintly as if lit from within by some cold and terrible light. It was the kind of white that belonged to corpses, to things that had been buried and then unearthed. The face was where the accounts diverged. Some said they had seen it clearly, a pale visage with hollow eyes and a mouth that did not move. Others said the face was veiled, hidden behind a layer of cloth or shadow. A blacksmith named Thomas Groom swore he had come face to face with the figure near the King Street Turnpike, and that the features were human, but wrong. The proportions distorted, the skin stretched too tight over the bones. He said the eyes had no colour, only darkness, and that when the figure looked at him, he felt as if something were reaching inside his chest and squeezing his heart. He ran. He was not ashamed to admit it. He ran and did not stop until he reached the safety of his forge, where he lit every lamp and sat with his back against the door until dawn. Another witness, a woman named Anne Porter, said she had seen the figure standing beneath a tree on the common, and that it had no face at all, only a smooth blankness where the features should have been, like a mask of wax. She fainted. When she woke, the figure was gone, but the grass where it had stood was blackened, as if scorched by fire or rot. The movements were unnatural. Every witness remarked on this. The figure did not walk as the living walked. It glided. It drifted. Its feet, if it had feet, did not touch the ground in any way that seemed normal. There was no sound of footsteps. No crunch of gravel, no splash of mud. It moved in silence, and the silence followed it like a shadow. Some said it seemed to float, rising and falling slightly as it progressed along the lane, as if carried on currents of air that no one else could feel. Others said it moved with a terrible slowness, each step deliberate and patient, as if time meant nothing to it, as if it had all the hours of eternity to reach its destination. And a few witnesses claimed the opposite, that the figure moved with impossible speed, that one moment it was far down the lane and the next it was standing directly before them, crossing the distance in the space of a heartbeat. The locations of the sightings formed a pattern. The figure appeared most often in the western part of the parish, along the roads and lanes that ran between the common and the river. Black Lion Lane was a frequent sight. So was the churchyard of St. Paul's, where the graves lay in neat rows beneath the yew trees. The common itself, a stretch of open ground used for grazing and gathering, became a place people avoided after dark. The footpaths that crossed it were empty. The benches where old men sat to smoke in the evening stood abandoned. The figure had been seen there at least a dozen times, standing at the edge of the trees or moving slowly across the open grass, always visible, always watching. The turnpike near King Street was another location. Several travellers passing through Hammersmith had encountered the figure there, and word had spread to the neighbouring parishes. Drivers began to take alternate routes. Coaches avoided the road after sunset. The turnpike keeper, a man named John Locke, said he had seen the figure 3 times in as many weeks, and that each time it had stood at the side of the road as if waiting for something or someone. By late December, the sightings were occurring almost nightly. The figure appeared at dusk as the light began to fail and the lamps were being lit in the houses. It appeared in the early evening when workers were making their way home. And it appeared late after midnight when the streets were empty and the only sound was the wind moving through the best branches. The frequency of the encounters meant that more and more people were seeing it, not just those who lived in Hammersmith, but visitors, travellers, people who had no connection to the parish and no reason to invent stories. A clerk from the city saw it near the river and wrote about it in a letter to his brother. A physician travelling to attend a patient encountered it on the road and later described the experience in his journal. A group of sailors returning to their ship in the docks passed the figure on King Street and swore they would never come back to Hammersmith again. The stories multiplied, the fear deepened, and the figure walked on. The effect on the parish was profound. Life did not stop, because life never stops, but it contracted. People went out only when necessary. Markets closed earlier. Taverns saw fewer customers. The streets that had once been busy with evening trade grew quiet. Women who worked as laundresses or seamstresses, women who depended on taking in work from the wealthier households, found their incomes shrinking because no one wanted to send a servant out after dark to deliver fabric or collect washing. Children were kept indoors. Schools dismissed earlier. Even the church saw a decline in attendance at evening services, though the vicar urged his parishioners not to give in to superstition. But superstition, if that was what it was, had proved stronger than faith. The ghost had power. It commanded the streets, and the people of Hammersmith, for all their prayers and protests, obeyed. There were attempts to confront the figure. Men, emboldened by drink or anger or simple frustration, went out into the lanes with the intention of catching the ghost and exposing it as a fraud. A group of bricklayers armed themselves with clubs and spent an entire night patrolling the common, calling out challenges into the dark. They saw nothing. A young man, determined to prove his courage to his sweetheart, walked alone to the churchyard at midnight and stood among the graves shouting that he was not afraid. The figure did not appear. But the next night it was seen by 3 different people in 3 different places, as if mocking the attempts to find it. Another group, more organised, set up a watch near Black Lion Lane, taking turns standing guard with lanterns and sticks. They maintained their vigil for 5 nights. On the 6th night, 2 of them saw the figure moving toward them through the fog. They shouted. They waved their lanterns. The figure stopped. It stood motionless for a long moment, and then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows before anyone could follow. The men returned to their homes shaken and silent. The watch was not resumed. The newspapers continued to report on the phenomenon. The Times carried a brief notice stating that the Hammersmith ghost had become a subject of considerable public interest, and that the local authorities were investigating the matter. But there was no investigation, not in any formal sense. The constables had no idea how to proceed. They could not arrest a ghost. They could not question it or compel it to appear. And so they did nothing, and the ghost continued to walk. Other papers took a more sensational approach. The Oracle published an account claiming the figure was the spirit of a murdered woman seeking justice for her death. The Morning Chronicle suggested it might be a demon, a servant of the devil sent to test the faith of the parish. A pamphlet appeared, sold on the streets for a penny, titled The True and Terrible History of the Hammersmith Phantom, which claimed the figure was the ghost of a man who had hanged himself in the churchyard 50 years earlier, and whose body had been buried in unconsecrated ground. None of these claims were supported by evidence, none of them were true, but they fed the fear, and the fear fed the legend. The winter grew colder. The frost hardened on the rooftops and did not melt. The Thames froze solid in places, and children skated on the ice near the banks. But in Hammersmith, there was no joy in the cold. The darkness came early and stayed late, and the ghost walked through it, like a figure in a nightmare. A carter named William Ford saw it on the road near the Common, and said it had reached out toward him as he passed, one pale arm extending from the white garment. He whipped his horse into a gallop and did not look back. A woman named Elizabeth Millwood encountered it near her home, and screamed so loudly that her neighbours came running with candles and knives. By the time they reached her, the figure was gone, but Elizabeth was on her knees in the mud, weeping. She could not be calmed. Her husband had to carry her inside. She did not speak for 2 days. By the end of December, the mood in the parish had shifted from fear to something darker. People were angry. They were tired of being afraid. They were tired of living like prisoners in their own homes, of rushing through the streets before sunset, of lying awake at night listening for footsteps that might or might not be there. The ghost had taken something from them, something more than Satan's safety. It had taken their sense of order, their belief that the world made sense, and they wanted it back. Men began to talk openly about violence, about hunting the figure down and destroying it, whatever it took, about putting an end to the haunting by force since prayer and patience had failed. The talk spread through the alehouses and workshops. It spread through the markets and the streets. And by the first days of January, a plan had formed. A group of men would arm themselves. They would patrol the lanes where the ghost had been seen most often. And if the figure appeared, they would not run, they would not hide. They would stand their ground, they would confront it. And if it turned out to be a man, a prankster, a fraud, they would drag him to the constable and see him punished. And if it turned out to be something else, something beyond the natural world, then God would have to guide their hands. Among the men who volunteered for this patrol was Francis Smith. He was 29 years old, a customs officer employed in the excise service, responsible for inspecting goods and collecting duties at the docks. He was married, he had no children, he was known as a sober man, reliable, not given to drink or wild behaviour. He owned a flintlock pistol, a weapon he'd purchased for protection during his work, as excise officers sometimes carried large sums of money and were targets for thieves. He'd never fired it at a person, he had never needed to, but he brought it with him when he joined the patrol. He loaded it carefully, he primed it, and on the night of January 3rd, he took his position in the shadows of Black Lion Lane, his back against a wall, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The night was cold and damp. The fog rolled in from the river, thick and white, muffling sound. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, somewhere a door slammed, but the lane itself was silent, empty, waited, and Francis Smith waited with it, the pistol heavy in his hand, his breath steaming in the air. He did not have to wait long. Chapter 3. The Parish in Terror. The fear had a weight to it now, a physical presence that pressed against the walls of every house and hung in the air like smoke. By the first week of January, Hammersmith had become a place where people spoke in whispers and looked over their shoulders even in daylight. The ghost had moved beyond rumour. It had moved beyond story. It was real as the cold that bit at exposed skin, as real as the hunger that gnawed at empty bellies. It had been seen by too many people, described in too much detail, encountered in too many places for doubt to survive. And with doubt gone, only terror remained. The parish had always been a close community, the kind of place where neighbours knew one another's business and strangers were noticed immediately. But the ghost had fractured that closeness. Trust eroded. Suspicion took root. People began to wonder if the figure might be one of their own, someone playing a cruel joke, someone who walked among them by day and donned a white sheet by night to torment his neighbours. But no one could think of who it might be. No one could imagine a motive. And so the suspicion turned inward, toward the self, toward the question of whether they were all going mad, whether the fear itself had conjured something out of nothing, a shared delusion born from darkness and isolation. The women of the parish suffered the most. They were the ones who moved through the streets most frequently, carrying water from the pump, taking laundry to the river, walking to market, visiting the sick. They could not avoid the lanes and footpaths where the ghost had been seen. They could not stay indoors at all hours, and so they went out in groups, clutching each other's arms, their voices high and nervous, their eyes darting toward every shadow. Some carried charms, small tokens of faith or superstition, crosses made of iron, bags of salt, prayers written on scraps of paper and tucked into their bodices. Others carried knives, small blades, or hidden in the folds of their skirts, weapons that would be useless against a spirit, but that offered some small comfort nonetheless. The older women taught the younger ones the old prayers, the ones that predated the church, the ones whispered in Latin, or half-remembered tongues, words that were supposed to ward off evil. But the prayers did not stop the sightings. The charms did not protect them. The ghost appeared to women as readily as it appeared to men, perhaps more so, as if it knew where the fear was strongest. One woman, a seamstress named Mary Green, saw the figure 3 times in a single week. The first time she was walking home from a customer's house near the common, her arms full of fabric. The sun was setting, the light fading to grey. She saw the figure standing at the edge of the trees, motionless, watching. She did not stop. She did not look directly at it. She walked faster, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short gasps. The second time she was at the pump filling a bucket. It was late afternoon, still light, but the sky was heavy with clouds. She looked up and saw the figure standing on the far side of the square, near the wall of the churchyard. This time she dropped the bucket. Water spilled across the ground. She ran. The third time she was in her own home, sitting by the window with her needlework. She glanced up and saw the figure standing in the lane outside, directly across from her door. It was looking at her. She could feel it, the weight of its gaze even through the glass. She pulled the curtain shut and sat in the dark, trembling until her husband came home. After that, she refused to leave the house. Her husband had to take over her work, delivering the finished garments himself, while Mary sat inside with the door locked and the windows covered. The children felt the fear as well, though they understood it differently. They did not speak of ghosts and spirits. They spoke of the white man, the tall man, the man with no face. They drew pictures of it in the dirt with sticks, crude figures in flowing robes. They told each other stories, embellishing and exaggerating until the figure became something monstrous, something with claws and teeth, something that ate children who wandered too far from home. Parents scolded them for it, told them to stop frightening each other, but the stories continued. And at night, when the children lay in their beds, they listened to the sounds outside, the wind rattling the shutters, the creak of wood settling, the distant bark of a dog, and they wondered if the white man was out there, walking past their windows, looking in. The economic impact of the haunting was severe. Hammersmith depended on trade, on the movement of goods and people along the roads that connected to London and the surrounding villages. But trade required travel. and travel after dark had become almost impossible. Carters refused to make deliveries in the evening. Wagoners demanded extra pay to pass through the parish after sunset. The coaching services that ran between London and the western counties began to avoid Hammersmith entirely, taking longer routes that bypassed the area. The taverns and inns lost business. The shops closed earlier. The market, which had always been busy on Saturday evenings, stood nearly empty. People were not spending money because they were not going out. They were hoarding what they had, keeping their doors locked, their fires burning, their familiars close. The parish was slowly being strangled by its own fear. The local clergy tried to intervene. The vicar of St. Paul's, a man named Reverend Thomas Bennett, delivered a sermon on the first Sunday in January, in which he urged his congregation not to give in to superstition. He reminded them that God was more powerful than any spirit, that faith was a shield against darkness, that fear itself was a sin, a lack of trust in divine providence. He spoke eloquently and with passion, but his words rang hollow, because the people sitting in the pews had seen the figure. They had encountered it on the roads and lanes they walked every day, and they knew, in the deep and wordless way that people know such things, that this was not a test of faith. This was something else, something older and stranger and more dangerous than a sermon could address. After the service, the vicar stood at the door and shook hands with his parishioners as they left. Many of them thanked him. None of them looked convinced. A few days later, Reverend Bennett attempted a more direct approach. He walked to the churchyard at dusk, accompanied by 2 church wardens, and conducted a prayer service among the graves. He read from the Bible passages about casting out demons and commanding unclean spirits to depart. He blessed the ground with holy water. He spoke the words of exorcism, the ancient formulas that the church had used for centuries to cleanse places of evil. The 3 men stood in the cold as the light faded, their breath misting, their voices rising into the empty air. Nothing happened. The churchyard remained silent. The grave sat undisturbed. And when the men finally left, walking quickly back toward the warmth and light of the vicarage, the ghost appeared behind them. A woman passing on the lane saw it standing among the headstones, exactly where the vicar had prayed. She screamed. The men turned and looked, but by then it was gone. The exorcism had failed. The constables were under increasing pressure to do something, anything, to restore order. But they had no authority to act against something that might not be human. Their jurisdiction covered crimes and disturbances, theft and assault, drunkenness and brawling. They had no training in dealing with the supernatural, and so they did what constables have always done when faced with a problem they cannot solve. They increased their presence. They walked the streets in pairs, carrying lanterns and truncheons, making themselves visible. They stopped people and asked questions. They investigated reports of suspicious activity. But the ghost did not appear when the constables were present. It appeared when the streets were empty, when the patrols had moved on, when there was no one to witness except the frightened and the vulnerable. And so the constables, for all their efforts, accomplished nothing. A public meeting was held at the town hall on the evening of January 2nd. The room was crowded, packed with men and women standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces grim. A local magistrate, a man named Sir John Lumley, presided. He stood at the front of the room and called for order, and when the noise finally subsided, he addressed the crowd. He acknowledged that the sightings were real, that something was happening in the parish, but he urged calm. He suggested that the figure might be a criminal, someone using the disguise of a ghost to cover his movements, perhaps a smuggler or a thief. He announced that a reward would be offered for information leading to the capture of the person responsible. He promised that the authorities would take every possible measure to ensure the safety of the residents. The crowd listened in silence. When he finished, someone shouted from the back of the room, "What if it's not a person? What if it's really a ghost?" The magistrate hesitated. He had no answer. The meeting dissolved into arguments and accusations, voices rising in anger and frustration, until finally Sir John called an end to the proceedings and dismissed the crowd. The people filed out into the cold night, no more reassured than when they had entered. In the absence of official action, the men of the parish took matters into their own hands. Small groups formed, informal patrols that walked the streets after dark, armed with clubs and knives and whatever else they could find. They moved in silence, their lanterns casting long shadows, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of white. They were not soldiers. They were not trained. They were bricklayers and blacksmiths, clerks and carters, ordinary men driven to desperation by fear and frustration. Some were brave, others were simply angry. All of them were determined. They would find the ghost. They would confront it, and they would end the haunting one way or another. Francis Smith joined one of these patrols. He was not the sort of man who sought out violence or danger. He had a steady job, a quiet life, but he was also a man who believed in order, in the rule of law, in the idea that problems could be solved through action and reason. And the ghost was a problem that needed solving. He met with the other men at the Black Lion Inn on the evening of January 3rd. There were 8 of them in total. They divided the parish into sections, each man taking responsibility for a different area. Smith chose Black Lion Lane, the road that ran past the church and down toward the river. It was one of the places where the ghost had been seen most frequently. If the figure appeared anywhere, it would appear there. The men synchronized their watches, they agreed to patrol until midnight, and then they left, each one walking alone into the dark. Smith positioned himself near the corner of the lane, where he had a clear view in both directions. The fog was thick, rolling in from the Thames in great white banks that obscured everything more than a dozen yards away. He could hear the river, the slow lap of water against the pilings, the creak of boats straining at their moorings. He could hear the wind moving through the bare branches of the trees, but he could not hear footsteps. He could not hear voices. The lane was empty, silent, as if the world had been emptied of life. He stood with his back against a wall, his coat pulled tight against the cold, the pistol in his hand. He had loaded it before leaving home, measuring the powder carefully, seating the ball, checking the flint. It was ready. He was ready. He told himself he was not afraid. But his heart was beating fast and his hands were cold and every shadow seemed to move. The hour passed slowly. 9 o'clock, 10, 11, nothing appeared. The lane remained empty. Smith shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to keep warm. His breath steamed in the air. His fingers ached from gripping the pistol. He thought about his wife, waiting at her home, wondering where he was. He thought about the people who'd seen the ghost, the terror in their faces when they described it. He thought about what he would do if it appeared. Would he have the courage to approach it? Would he be able to aim the pistol steady? Would the weapon even work against something that might not be flesh and blood? The question circled in his mind unanswered, as the fog pressed closer and the cold seeped deeper into his bones. And then, just before midnight, he saw movement. A figure, pale in the darkness, walking toward him through the fog. It was tall, it was dressed in white, and it was coming closer. Smith's heart lurched. His grip tightened on the pistol. He stepped forward, away from the wall, into the centre of the lane. He called out, his voice loud and sharp, echoing in the silence. "Stop! Stand and declare yourself!" The figure did not stop. It continued walking slow and steady, gliding through the fog. Smith raised the pistol. His hand was shaking. He called out again, louder this time, a warning and a threat. "I am armed. Stop where you are or I will fire." The figure kept coming, and Francis Smith, a man who had never killed anything larger than a rabbit, a man who believed in law and reason and the goodness of ordinary life, pulled the trigger. The shot rang out across the lane, a crack like breaking bone, and the figure fell forward into the mud without a sound. Chapter 4. The Hunters Gather. The decision to hunt the ghost did not come suddenly. It accumulated day by day, conversation by conversation, in the way that desperate ideas always accumulate when fear has been allowed to fester too long. Men met in the alehouses after their work was done, nursing pints of ale that grew warm in their hands as they talked. They met in workshops and on street corners, in low voices that carried an edge of anger. They were tired. They were frightened for their families. And they were beginning to feel something worse than fear, something more corrosive. They were beginning to feel helpless. And men who feel helpless will do dangerous things to prove to themselves that they are not. The Black Lion Inn stood at the corner of King Street and Black Lion Lane, a timber-framed building with small windows and a low ceiling blackened by years of smoke. It was the kind of place where working men gathered, where the beer was cheap and the fire was kept burning and no one asked too many questions. On the evening of January 2nd, a Monday, a group of men assembled there in the back room, away from the main tap room where strangers might overhear. There were perhaps a dozen of them at first, though the number grew as word spread. They were not organised. They had no leader, no formal plan. But they shared a common purpose. The ghost had to be stopped. And if the constables would not stop it, if the church could not stop it, then they would. The talk began cautiously. One man, a carpenter named William Stowe, suggested that the figure might be someone from outside the parish, someone who did not know the harm his prank was causing. Perhaps if they could catch him and explain the consequences, the fear and suffering, he would stop voluntarily. Another man, older, shook his head. He said he had seen the figure himself, had watched it move across the common, and that no living person moved that way. If it was a man in a sheet, then it was a man who knew exactly what he was doing, who wanted to frighten people, who took pleasure in their terror. Such a person deserved no mercy. A third voice spoke up from the corner. What if it's not a man at all? The room fell silent. No one wanted to say it aloud, but they were all thinking it. What if the ghost was real? What if they were planning to confront something that could not be threatened, or harmed, or reasoned with? Chapter 5. The night of January 3rd. The day began unremarkably. The sun rose late over Hammersmith, pale and cold, struggling through the thick clouds that had settled over the Thames Valley like a grey shroud. The frost lay heavy on the rooftops and did not melt. The river moved sluggishly, carrying debris and ice toward the city. In the houses and workshops, people rose and dressed and went about their business with the mechanical movements of those who have not slept well, who have spent the night listening to every sound beyond their walls. The ghost had not been seen the previous evening, and this small mercy was discussed in whispers at the market, as if speaking to, loudly might summon the figure back into being. But the relief was temporary. Everyone knew the apparition would return. It always returned. Francis Smith woke before dawn in the small house he shared with his wife on a narrow street near the river. The room was cold despite the coals still glowing in the grate. He dressed quietly, pulling on his wool trousers and shirt, his waistcoat and coat, the layers of clothing that marked him as a man of modest but respectable employment. His wife stirred in the bed but did not wake. She had grown accustomed to his early rising, the demands of his work as an excise officer requiring him to be at the docks before the ships unloaded their cargo. He stood for a moment looking at her in the dim light, her face peaceful in sleep, her dark hair loose on the pillow. He thought about telling her what he planned to do that evening. He thought about the pistol wrapped in cloth and hidden in the bottom drawer of the chest, but he said nothing. He left the room and went downstairs to light the fire and heat water for tea. The day passed in its usual rhythm. Smith walked to the customs house near the docks and spent the morning inspecting manifests, checking cargo against the lists provided by ship captains, calculating the duties owed to the Crown. It was meticulous work. Work that required attention to detail and a certain stubbornness in the face of merchants who tried to undervalue their goods or hide items that would incur higher taxes. Smith was good at his job. He caught discrepancies, he asked questions, he made notes in his careful handwriting. But throughout the day, his mind kept returning to the evening ahead, to the patrol, to the possibility of encountering the figure that had terrorised the parish for 3 months. He had volunteered for this. He had insisted on taking one of the most dangerous sections of the patrol route. And now, as the afternoon wore on and the light began to fade, he felt the first cold touch of doubt. He returned home as the church bell struck 5. His wife had prepared supper, a simple meal of bread and cheese and cold meat, and they ate together by the fire. She talked about her day, about the neighbour's child who had fallen ill, about the price of coal, about small domestic matters that seemed impossibly distant from the darkness gathering outside. Smith listened and nodded, but contributed little to the conversation. Finally, his wife set down her cup and looked at him directly. "You're going out tonight," she said. It was not a question. He met her eyes. "There's a patrol," he said. "A group of us. We're going to watch for the ghost." She was silent for a long moment. Then she rose and began clearing the table, her movements quick and precise. "Take care," she said, her voice tight. "Whatever it is, take care." He promised he would, but the promise felt hollow, a thing said because it was expected, rather than because it could be kept. At 7:30, Smith took the pistol from the drawer where he had hidden it. It was a flintlock, well made, with a walnut stock and a barrel just over a foot long. He had purchased it 2 years earlier from a gunsmith in Holborn, paying more than he could comfortably afford because he wanted something reliable. As an excise officer, he sometimes carried substantial sums of money, and the roads could be dangerous. But he had never fired it at a person. He had practiced with it, shooting at targets in a field outside the city, learning the weight and balance, the kick of the recoil, the time it took to reload. He was a competent shot, though not exceptional. Now he loaded it carefully, measuring the black powder from his horn, wrapping the lead ball in a patch of cloth, ramming it down the barrel with the rod. He primed the pan with finer powder and checked the flint. The mechanism was sound, the weapon was ready. He wrapped it in a length of cloth to keep it dry and slipped it inside his coat. The Black Lion Inn was already crowded when he arrived shortly after 8. The back room where the men had gathered the previous evening was full, the air thick with pipe smoke and the smell of wet wool and ale. Smith recognised most of the faces. William Stowe the carpenter was there, his hands still stained with sawdust. Thomas Groom the blacksmith stood near the fire, his massive arms crossed over his chest. John Locke the turnpike keeper sat at a table with a mug of beer, his face creased with worry. There were others as well, men Smith knew by sight, if not by name, men who worked the docks or drove wagons or kept shops. They were not a mob. They were not drunk or wild-eyed. They were simply men who had decided they could not live in fear any longer, who had chosen action over paralysis, however dangerous that action might be. The man who seemed to have taken charge was a butcher named Henry Wall, a broad-shouldered figure with a florid face and a voice that carried authority. He stood at the centre of the room and called for quiet, and gradually the conversation ceased and the men turned to listen. Wall laid out the plan. The parish would be divided into sections, each man taking responsibility for patrolling a specific area. They would walk alone, because a group would be too conspicuous, too easy for the ghost to avoid. They would maintain their positions until midnight, moving slowly through their assigned routes, watching for any sign of the white figure. If the ghost appeared, the man who saw it was to call out, to challenge it, to determine whether it was human or something else. And if it proved to be human, if the ghost was revealed as a man in disguise, then they were to apprehend him by whatever means necessary and bring him to the constable. "And if it's not a man?" someone asked from the back of the room. Wall hesitated. "Then we'll deal with that as we must," he said finally. "But I don't believe in ghosts. I believe in men who use fear to hide their crimes. And tonight, we'll prove it." There was a murmur of agreement, though not everyone looked convinced. Smith said nothing. He stood near the wall, the pistol a heavy weight against his ribs, and listened as the sections were assigned. When his turn came, he asked for Black Lion Lane. Wall raised an eyebrow. "That's where it's been seen most," he said. "Are you certain?" Smith nodded. He was certain. If the ghost was going to appear anywhere, it would appear there. And he wanted to be the one to face it. The men left the inn in small groups, walking in different directions so as not to attract attention. Smith went alone, his hands thrust deep in his coat pockets, his head down against the cold. The fog was already rising from the river, thick white tendrils creeping through the streets, muffling sound and obscuring vision. The lamps had been lit along the main roads, their flames flickering behind clouded glass, but the side lanes remained dark. Black Lion Lane ran south from King Street down toward the river, a narrow road lined with houses and workshops, with the churchyard of St. Paul's on the eastern side. It was a place Smith knew well, having walked it countless times in daylight. But at night, in the fog, it seemed different, unfamiliar. The buildings leaned closer together. The shadows pressed deeper. Every doorway might hide something, every sound might be a footstep. Smith took up his position near the corner where Black Lion Lane met the churchyard wall. From here he could see in both directions, though the fog limited his sight to perhaps 20 yards. Behind him, the church rose like a darker shadow against the dark sky, its tower lost in the mist. The graves lay beyond the wall, invisible but present, a reminder that the dead outnumbered the living in this place. He pulled the pistol from inside his coat and checked it again, making sure the priming powder was dry, that the flint was secure. Then he held it down at his side, concealed by the folds of his coat, and settled into wait. The cold was immediate and penetrating. It came up from the frozen ground and down from the night sky, and pressed inward from all sides. Smith stamped his feet quietly, trying to maintain circulation, but he did not dare move from his position. Minutes passed. A quarter hour, half an hour. The street remained empty. Somewhere a dog barked, the sound muffled and distant. Somewhere a door slammed. But no one walked the lane, no one passed. The fog grew thicker, reducing visibility further, until Smith could barely see more than a dozen paces in any direction. He began to wonder if the ghost would appear at all, if perhaps the increased patrols had frightened it away, if it even knew or cared that men were hunting it. And then he heard something. Footsteps, slow and measured, coming from the south, from the direction of the river. Smith's heart began to beat faster. He tightened his grip on the pistol, though he kept it hidden. He strained his eyes against the fog, trying to see. The footsteps grew closer, and then a figure emerged from the white mist, walking steadily up the centre of the lane. It was tall. It was dressed entirely in white. The garment hung from its shoulders to the ground, shapeless and flowing. The face was pale, indistinct in the fog. It did not hurry, it did not hesitate. It simply walked forward with that same terrible slowness that every witness had described. Smith's mouth went dry. His breathing quickened. This was it. This was the ghost. He stepped forward into the centre of the lane, moving out of the shadows, making himself visible. He raised his free hand. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "Stop where you are!" The figure continued walking. It did not acknowledge him. It showed no sign of having heard. Smith's mind raced. Was it deaf? Was it ignoring him deliberately? Or was it truly something that existed beyond the reach of human commands? He shouted again, louder this time, putting all his authority into his voice. "I command you to stop! Declare yourself! Who are you?" Still the figure came on. It was perhaps 15 paces away now, close enough that Smith could see the white garment moving in the slight breeze, could see the pale blur of the face beneath the hood or veil or whatever covered it. Terror gripped him then, pure and overwhelming. This was not a man. It could not be a man. No man would ignore such a challenge. No man would continue walking towards someone who was shouting at him in the middle of the night. This was the ghost. This was the thing that had haunted the parish for 3 months, that had driven women to miscarry and old people to their graves. And it was coming for him. Smith pulled the pistol from his coat and raised it with both hands, trying to hold it steady. "Stop, or I will fire!" he shouted. His voice sounded thin and desperate, even to his own ears. "I'm armed! Stop!" The figure was 10 paces away, then 8, then 6. It did not stop. It did not slow. Its face remained blank, expressionless, impossible to read. And Francis Smith, his finger trembling on the trigger, made a decision. He aimed at the centre of the white shape and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the narrow lane. The flash lit the fog like lightning. The recoil drove the pistol upward and back, nearly tearing it from Smith's hands. Smoke billowed out, adding to the mist, filling the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder. For a moment Smith could see nothing. He stood frozen, his ears ringing, his arms still extended, the pistol smoking in his hands. Then the smoke began to clear, and he saw the figure lying in the road. It had fallen forward, crumpled onto the cobblestones. The white garment spread around it like a collapsed tent. It was not moving. Smith lowered the pistol slowly. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He took a step forward, then another. His legs felt weak, unsteady. He reached the fallen figure and looked down. It was a man, not a ghost, not a spirit. A man. He lay face down in the mud, his arms sprawled to the sides. The white garment was not a shroud, it was not a winding sheet. It was a set of work clothes, a plasterer's overalls covered in white dust and lime. The hood that had obscured the face was a piece of sacking tied around the head to keep off the cold and wet. And beside the body, spilled across the cobblestones, were the tools of a bricklayer's trade, a trowel and a bucket and a length of rope. Smith stared. He could not move, could not think. He had killed a workman. He had shot a man coming home from his job. The white clothes were not a disguise. They were simply the clothes of someone who worked with plaster and whitewash, someone whose profession left him covered in pale dust. The figure had not been gliding. It had been walking slowly because it was tired, because it was late, because it was cold. And it had not stopped when challenged, because perhaps it had not heard, or had not stood, or had been too exhausted to care about some stranger shouting in the fog. Doors began to open along the lane. Candles flickered to life in windows. Voices called out, asking what had happened. Who had fired a shot? Smith stood motionless, the pistol hanging from his hand, staring down at the body. Someone ran toward him, boots splashing through the mud. Someone else shouted for the constable. The world seemed to move in fragments, disconnected images that Smith's mind could not process into a coherent whole. He had been hunting a ghost. He had found a man, and now that man was dead, bleeding into the frozen mud of Black Lion Lane, while Francis Smith stood over him with a smoking pistol and the terrible understanding that his life, his careful, ordinary law-abiding life, had just ended as completely as if he too had been shot through the heart. Chapter 6. The Fate Pull Pist Gur. The man's name was Thomas Millwood. He was 23 years old. He lived with his mother and his sister in a small house on the Strand on the Green, a hamlet that lay along the river about a mile south of Black Lion Lane. He worked as a bricklayer's assistant, travelling each day to whatever site required his labour, carrying tools and mixing mortar and learning the trade that would, if he lived long enough, allow him to call himself a journeyman and then perhaps a master. On the evening of January 3rd, he had been working at a house in Ealing, several miles west of Hammersmith, helping to repair a chimney that had been damaged in a winter storm. The work had taken longer than expected. By the time the crew finished and the foreman paid them, it was already dark. The other men lived closer to the work site. Millwood alone had to walk back to Hammersmith and then home to the Strand. He set out just after 9 o'clock. He wore the clothes of his trade, canvas trousers and a heavy shirt, both white from the lime and plaster dust that had accumulated over weeks of work. Over this he wore a long smock, also white, also stiffened with dried mortar. It was practical clothing meant to protect his regular garments from the caustic materials he worked with daily. The white was not a choice. It was simply the colour that plaster left behind, a badge of his profession that could be seen on masons and plasterers throughout the city. He carried his tools in a wooden bucket wrapped in a piece of sacking to keep them from rattling. Over his head he had tied a piece of cloth, a makeshift hood fashioned from an old flour sack, because the night was cold and damp and he had a long walk ahead of him. The route from Ealing to the Strand on the Green ran through Hammersmith. There was no avoiding it. Millwood knew about the ghost, of course. Everyone in the area knew about it. He had heard the stories in the alehouses where the workmen gathered, had listened to the increasingly wild tales of a spectre that walked the lanes and frightened women and children. But Millwood had never seen it himself. He did not believe in ghosts. He was a practical young man, the son of a practical family, raised to work with his hands and trust only what could be seen and touched and measured. Ghost stories were for people with too much time and too little sense. He was not afraid of walking at night. He had done it countless times. And so he set out along the dark road without hesitation, his bucket swinging from one hand, his mind already on the warm fire and the supper that waited for him at home. He walked steadily, his pace neither hurried nor slow. The fog was thick, but he knew the roads well enough to navigate them even in poor visibility. He passed through Ealing and onto the main highway that led toward Hammersmith, following the route he had taken 100 times before. Other travellers moved through the fog around him, though he saw them only as shadows, shapes that emerged briefly from the white mist and then disappeared again. No one spoke, no one acknowledged one another. This was the way of London at night, each person enclosed in their own small sphere of isolation, moving through the darkness toward their separate destinations. As he approached Hammersmith, the road narrowed and divided into several lanes. Millwood turned onto King Street and then south onto Black Lion Lane, the most direct route to the river and home. The lane was darker than the main road, less trafficked, lined with houses that stood close together with their shutters pulled tight against the night. The fog here seemed thicker, pooling in the low places, rising like steam from the frozen ground. Millwood walked down the centre of the lane, his boots making soft splashing sounds in the mud. He was thinking about his sister, who had promised to save him a portion of the stew she was making. He was thinking about his bed, about sleep, about the comfort of being warm and safe after a long day of hard labour. He was not thinking about ghosts. He was not thinking about danger. Francis Smith saw him when he was perhaps 30 yards away, a pale figure emerging from the fog at the southern end of the lane. In the darkness and mist, in the state of heightened fear and anticipation that Smith had worked himself into over the past 3 hours, the figure looked exactly like every description of the ghost he had heard. Tall, because Millwood was above average height. White, because of the plastered clothing. Moving slowly, because Millwood was tired. The shape was indistinct, lacking clear features, because the fog obscured details and the makeshift hood hid Millwood's face. To Smith, standing in the shadows with a loaded pistol and 3 months of accumulated terror pressing against his chest, this was not a workman coming home late. This was the ghost. This was the thing that had to be stopped. He called out, his voice echoed off the walls of the narrow lane, sharp and commanding. "Stop, stop where you are!" Millwood heard him. He must have heard him. But he did not stop. Perhaps he thought the shout was directed at someone else. Perhaps he was too tired to care about some stranger yelling in the dark. Perhaps he simply did not understand the urgency in Smith's voice, could not imagine that anyone would have a reason to threaten him. He continued walking, his pace unchanged, his bucket swinging from his hand. Smith shouted again, louder, his voice rising towards panic. "I command you to stop! Declare yourself! Who are you, nurse?" Still Millwood came on. He was closer now, close enough that Smith could see the white garment moving, could see the shape of the head beneath the hood, could see the figure's relentless approach. And every second of silence, every step that brought the figure closer without response, confirmed in Smith's mind that this was not human. No man would ignore such a challenge. No man would keep walking towards someone who was shouting at him with such obvious fear and fury. Smith pulled the pistol from his coat. His hands were shaking badly now, his fingers stiff from the cold, from adrenaline, from terror. He raised the weapon and pointed it at the approaching figure. His voice cracked as he shouted the final warning. "Stop or I will fire! I am armed! Stop!" The figure was perhaps 20 feet away, then 15, then 10. It did not stop, it did not raise its hands, it did not speak. It simply continued its slow, steady advance, as inevitable as the tide, as patient as death itself. And Francis Smith, his mind blank with fear, his training abandoned, his reason drowned in panic, pulled the trigger. The ball struck Thomas Millwood in the left side of his chest, just below the collarbone. It tore through his smock and shirt and the soft tissue beneath, puncturing the lung, severing blood vessels, carrying fragments of cloth and powder into the wound. The impact drove Millwood backward half a step. He made a sound, a short exhalation that might have been surprise or pain or simply the air being forced from his lungs. His arms dropped. The bucket fell from his hand, clattering on the cobblestones, spilling tools. For a moment he stood swaying, his legs uncertain, his body no longer responding to his commands. Then his knees buckled and he fell forward onto his face in the mud. He did not try to catch himself, he did not cry out. He simply fell, his arms sprawling to the sides, his head turned to one side, his eyes still open but seeing nothing. Smith stood frozen, the pistol still extended, smoke curling from the barrel. His ears rang from the explosion. His arms trembled from the recoil. For several seconds he could not move, could not think, could only stare at the fallen figure through the smoke and fog. Then slowly, as if waking from a dream, he lowered the weapon. His mind began to work again, processing what had happened, what he had done. He had fired the pistol, he had hit the target. The ghost had fallen, but something was wrong. The figure was too still, too solid, too real. Smith took a step forward, then another. His legs felt weak, as if they might give way beneath him. He reached the body and looked down. The recognition came in stages, each detail a separate blow. The white garment was not a shroud, but work clothes. The hood was not a veil, but a piece of sacking. The bucket lying beside the body contained not supernatural implements, but the ordinary tools of a tradesman. And the face, now visible where the hood had fallen away, was not pale and hollow and empty. It was the face of a young man, a living man, with colour still in his cheeks and breath still moving his chest in shallow, laboured gasps. Millwood was not dead, not yet, but he was dying. Smith could see the blood spreading across the white smock, dark and thick, pooling in the mud beneath the body. He could hear the wet, rattling sound of Millwood's breathing, the sound of lungs filling with blood. Horror crashed over Smith like a wave. He dropped the pistol. It fell into the mud with a soft thud. He sank to his knees beside the body, his hands hovering over the Millwood, without touching him, as if afraid that contact would make it more real, would confirm what had happened. "No," he said. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "No, no, no." He looked around wildly, hoping someone would appear, someone who could help, someone who could undo what had been done. But the lane was empty. The doors remained closed. The windows showed no light. For a moment it seemed as if he and Millwood were alone in the world, two figures in the fog, one kneeling and one dying, locked together in a tragedy that could not be reversed. Then sound returned. Doors opening, voices calling out, footsteps running towards the sound of the shot. A woman screamed. A man shouted for the constable. People emerged from their houses, pulling on coats, carrying candles that guttered in the damp air. They formed a circle around Smith and the fallen man, their faces shocked and frightened. Someone knelt beside Millwood and tried to turn him over, but the young man cried out in pain and they stopped. Someone else ran for a doctor. A woman brought a blanket and tried to cover Millwood, to keep him warm, though they all knew it was useless. The wound was mortal. The blood loss was too great. Millwood was dying there in the lane, far from his home, surrounded by strangers, killed by a man who had mistaken him for a ghost. John Locke, the turnpike keeper, arrived and took charge. He was one of the men from the patrol, and he recognised Smith immediately. "Francis," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What happened? What did you do?" Smith looked up at him with empty eyes. "I thought he was the ghost," he said. "I thought." His voice trailed off. He could not finish the sentence, could not explain how he had been so certain, so absolutely convinced that the figure approaching him was not human. Locke looked from Smith to the dying man in the white smock and his face went grey. "Dear God," he whispered. "Dear God, Francis, what have you done?" The constable arrived within minutes, summoned by the growing crowd. His name was William Feltham, a solid man in his 40s who had served as a parish constable for nearly a decade. He assessed the situation quickly, his experienced eyes taking in the pistol lying in the mud, the man on his knees, the blood spreading across the cobblestones. "Who fired the shot?" he asked. Smith raised one hand slowly. "I did," he said. "I thought he was the ghost. I called out. I warned him. He wouldn't stop." Feltham nodded slowly. He knelt beside Millwood and felt for a pulse at the young man's neck. He found it, weak and rapid, fluttering like a trapped bird. "He's still alive," Feltham said. "We need a surgeon. Now." But even as he spoke, he knew it was hopeless. He had seen enough wounds to recognise a fatal one. Thomas Millwood died at midnight, roughly an hour after being shot. The surgeon who examined him said the ball had pierced the left lung and probably nicked the heart as well. There was nothing to be done. Millwood never regained full consciousness. He made sounds, wordless moans of pain and confusion, but he could not speak. He did not know where he was or what had happened to him. His last sensation, if he felt anything at all, would have been cold and wet, and the distant awareness of voices speaking words he could not understand. He died in the house nearest to where he fell, carried inside by neighbours who laid him on a table and tried unsuccessfully to stop the bleeding. His mother and sister were not present. They were at home, perhaps sitting by their own fire, perhaps already in bed, unaware that their son and brother would never walk through their door again. Francis Smith was placed under arrest. Feltham performed the duty with quiet efficiency, asking Smith to stand, to extend his hands to confirm his name and residence. Smith complied without resistance. He seemed to be in a state of shock, his face blank, his movements mechanical. When Feltham led him away toward the roundhouse where prisoners were held pending trial, Smith looked back once at the house where Millwood had died. The door stood open. Light spilled out onto the muddy lane, and Francis Smith, who had spent the evening hunting a ghost, was led away into the darkness, a murderer now, whether he had intended it or not. Chapter 7. The Arrest and Outcry. The news spread through Hammersmith before dawn. It moved from house to house like fire through dry timber, carried by those who had witnessed the shooting, by those who had heard the shot and come running, by those who had seen the constable leading Francis Smith away in the darkness. By the time the sun rose pale and cold over the Thames, there was not a person in the parish who did not know what had happened. A man had been killed, shot dead in Black Lion Lane, and the killer was not the ghost. The killer was one of their own. The immediate response was confusion. People could not reconcile what they had been told with what they had believed. For 3 months they had lived in terror of a supernatural apparition, a spirit returned from death to walk among the living. They had altered their lives around this belief. They had locked their doors and kept their children inside and avoided the streets after dark. They had prayed and carried charms and whispered the old protections against evil. And now they were being told that the ghost had been a man, an ordinary working man coming home in his work clothes, and that another man had shot him dead out of fear and confusion. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. Some refused to believe it. They insisted that Millwood could not have been the ghost, that the real ghost was still out there, that the apparition and the unfortunate plasterer were two separate things that had been tragically conflated. Others seized on the news with a kind of desperate relief, as if the killing, however terrible, at least provided an answer, an explanation, a way to make sense of the inexplicable. The mood in the parish shifted rapidly from confusion to anger. By mid-morning, groups of men and women had gathered in the streets, talking in loud voices, their faces flushed with emotion. Some directed their anger at Francis Smith. He had acted recklessly, they said. He had fired without confirming his target. He had killed an innocent man because of his own cowardice and paranoia. Others defended him. They pointed out that Smith had called out multiple times, that he had given clear warnings, that any reasonable person would have stopped when challenged by someone obviously armed. If Millwood had simply halted and identified himself, he would still be alive. The fact that he had continued walking despite the warnings suggested he had been deaf or foolish, or perhaps deliberately playing the role of the ghost to frighten people. This latter theory gained traction among those who wanted to believe that Millwood had somehow brought his death upon himself. The truth was more complicated and sadder than either side wanted to acknowledge. Thomas Millwood had been a quiet young man, well liked by those who knew him. hard-working and responsible. He had no history of causing trouble. He did not drink to excess. He attended church irregularly but was not considered impious. He lived with his family and contributed his wages to the household. There was nothing in his character or behaviour that suggested he would deliberately terrorise his neighbours by pretending to be a ghost. The white clothes were simply the clothes of his trade. The slow walking was the tired pace of someone who'd worked a long day. The failure to stop when challenged might have had any number of explanations. Perhaps he had not heard clearly over the sound of the wind. Perhaps he had thought the shouting was directed at someone else. Perhaps he had been lost in his own thoughts, thinking of home and supper, and had not processed the warnings until it was too late. Or perhaps, in the fog and darkness, he had not even seen Smith standing in the shadows with a pistol raised. The Millwood family received the news at dawn when a constable knocked on their door. Thomas's mother collapsed when told her son was dead. His sister, a young woman named Elizabeth, stood frozen in the doorway, unable to comprehend what was being said. Their father had died years earlier. Thomas had been the man of the house, the one who brought home wages, who would someday marry and provide them with security. Now that future was gone, erased in an instant by a lead ball fired from a pistol in a fog-shrouded lane. The family's grief was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbours heard the wailing through the walls and came to offer what comfort they could. But there was no comfort to be given. A young man was dead. His body lay in the parish mortuary. And his killers, in a sense, were not one man but an entire community that had allowed fear to grow until it became a weapon. The body was examined by the parish surgeon, a man named William Lynn, who performed a cursory autopsy to determine the cause of death. The findings were straightforward. The ball had entered Millwood's chest slightly to the left of centre, passed through the upper lobe of the left lung, and exited through the back, leaving a wound channel approximately 1 inch in diameter. Death had resulted from a combination of blood loss and respiratory failure. Lynn estimated that Millwood had lived for approximately 45 minutes to an hour after being shot, though he would have been unconscious or semi-conscious for most of that time. The wound was consistent with a pistol fired from a distance of 10 to 15 feet. There were no other injuries on the body, no signs of struggle or defensive wounds. Thomas Millwood had been walking home when he was shot, and he had died shortly afterward. The surgeon's report was brief and clinical. It did not mention the waste of it, the senselessness, the fact that this death should never have happened. Francis Smith spent the night following the shooting in the roundhouse, a small stone building used to hold prisoners awaiting trial. He sat on a wooden bench in a cell barely large enough to stand in, his head in his hands, replaying the events of the evening over and over in his mind. He could not escape the image of the white figure approaching him through the fog, could not forget the terror he had felt, the absolute certainty that he was facing something supernatural. And yet, when he thought about the moment after he fired, when he had seen the bucket and the tools and the face of a young man dying in the mud, he felt as if the ground had opened beneath him. He had killed someone. He had taken a life. And no matter how justified he had felt in that moment, no matter how convinced he had been that he was protecting himself and his community, the fact remained. Thomas Millwood was dead, and Francis Smith had pulled the trigger. He was visited in the morning by a magistrate, the same Sir John Lumley, who had presided over the public meeting days earlier. Lumley was accompanied by a clerk who took notes as Smith recounted his version of events. Smith spoke slowly, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep and from crying. He explained about the patrol, about his position in Black Lion Lane, about the figure emerging from the fog. He described calling out repeatedly, warning the figure to stop, receiving no response. He said he had been certain, absolutely certain, that he was facing the ghost that had terrorised the parish for months. He had acted in self-defence, or in defence of the community, or in the grip of a fear so profound that it had temporarily overridden his judgment. He did not try to excuse what he had done. He simply wanted Lumley to understand why he had done it. Lumley listened without interrupting. When Smith finished, the magistrate sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You have placed us all in a difficult position, Mr. Smith," he said finally. "What you describe may be understandable, even sympathetic, but the law is clear. You fired a weapon at another person without lawful excuse and that person died as a result. The crime is murder, or at the very least manslaughter, and you will have to stand trial." Smith nodded slowly. He had expected this. He had known, from the moment he saw Millwood's face, that his life was over. Whether he hanged or spent years in prison, or somehow escaped punishment entirely, he would never be the same man he had been. The Francis Smith who had kissed his wife goodbye and walked to the Black Lion Inn with a pistol in his coat no longer existed. The case became public knowledge immediately. By midday on January 4th, the London newspapers had gotten hold of the story. The Morning Post ran a brief article under the heading "Fatal Shooting in Hammersmith," describing the basic facts. A man had been killed by another man who claimed to have mistaken him for a ghost. The Times provided more detail, naming both Smith and Millwood and including testimony from witnesses who had seen the aftermath. The article noted that the victim had been wearing white work clothes and that the shooter had been part of a patrol organised to hunt what locals believed to be a supernatural apparition. The tone was one of fascinated horror, the kind of prurient interest that newspapers have always taken in violence that involves elements of the strange or inexplicable. Within days, the story had spread beyond London. Provincial papers picked it up. Pamphlets were printed and sold on street corners, each one embellishing the facts with additional details, some true and some invented. Ballads were written, crude verses set to popular tunes, recounting the tragedy in language designed to provoke tears or outrage. The case became a sensation, not because of the violence itself, which was commonplace enough in a city where murder occurred with depressing regularity, but because of the circumstances. A ghost hunt, patrol of armed men, a fatal mistake born of fear and fog. It had all the elements of a morality tale, a cautionary story about the dangers of superstition and mob justice. The parish of Hammersmith found itself under scrutiny. Outsiders arrived, curious seekers and journalists and sensation hunters who walked the lanes where the ghost had been seen and stood at the spot where Millwood had fallen. They interviewed residents, asking about the sightings, about the atmosphere of fear, about whether the figure had truly been supernatural or merely a series of mistakes and misidentifications. The answers they received were contradictory. Some insisted the ghost had been real, that Millwood could not possibly account for all the sightings over 3 months. Others said the whole thing had been mass hysteria, that there had never been a ghost at all, only shadows and imagination and the willingness of frightened people to see what they expected to see. A few suggested that someone had indeed been playing the ghost deliberately, and that Millwood had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught up in something he had nothing to do with. The question of whether there had been a real ghost remained unresolved. After the shooting, the sightings stopped. The figure in white was never seen again. Some took this as proof that Millwood had been the ghost all along, that he had been walking home from work each evening in his white clothes and had been mistaken for a spirit. But this explanation satisfied no one. Millwood worked during the day and returned home in the evening. He had no reason to be wandering through churchyards and standing in lanes at midnight, and the descriptions of the ghost, while they matched Millwood in terms of colour and height, included details that did not fit. The hollow eyes, the gliding movement, the sense of cold that accompanied it. These were not things that could be explained by a tired plasterer walking home with a bucket of tools. The alternative explanation, whispered in corners but rarely stated openly, was that there had been 2 things happening simultaneously. A real ghost, or something that appeared to be a ghost, had been walking the lanes of Hammersmith, and separately, coincidentally, Thomas Millwood had been travelling those same lanes in clothing that happened to match the ghost's description. The two had collided on the night of January 3rd, and Millwood had paid for the collision with his life. This theory had the advantage of accounting for all the facts, but it required accepting that the supernatural was real, that ghosts existed, that the boundary between the living and the dead was more porous than reason allowed. Most people were not prepared to make that leap. And so the question hung in the air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. What had the people of Hammersmith really seen during those 3 months of fear? And had Francis Smith killed a man, or had he killed something else? Francis Smith would face trial at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court of England, in the coming weeks. The charge would be murder. The penalty, if convicted, would be death by hanging. And the people of Hammersmith would wait, divided in their opinions, united only in their shock that the ghost hunt had ended, not with the capture of a phantom, but with the death of one of their own. Chapter 8. The Trial at the Old Bailey. The Old Bailey stood in the heart of London, a grey stone fortress of justice that had witnessed centuries of trials, convictions and executions. Its formal name was the Central Criminal Court, but everyone called it the Old Bailey, after the street on which it stood. The building was imposing, designed to inspire fear and respect in equal measure. Inside, the courtroom was a theatre of judgment, with the judge's bench elevated above the well of the court, the jury box to one side, the dock where prisoners stood to face their accusers on the other. The public galleries were always crowded during interesting trials, filled with spectators who came to watch justice being dispensed like others might attend a play. The trial of Francis Smith promised to be one of the most interesting cases of the year. The proceedings began on the 13th of January 1804, just 10 days after the shooting. The speed was unusual but not unprecedented. In an age before elaborate forensic investigation, before lengthy legal manoeuvring, trials moved quickly. The facts were simple. A man had shot another man. That man had died. The question was whether the shooting constituted murder, manslaughter, or justifiable homicide. The court would hear testimony, the jury would deliberate, and a verdict would be rendered, all within the space of a day or two. Francis Smith would learn his fate before the week was out. Smith entered the courtroom under guard, walking stiffly in the clothes he had worn when arrested. He had been allowed to wash and shave, but his face was haggard, his eyes ringed with dark circles. He had not slept properly since the shooting. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the white figure approaching through the fog, heard his own voice shouting warnings, felt the pistol kick in his hands, and then the aftermath, the terrible moment of recognition when he saw what he had done. The memory played over and over, an endless loop that would not stop. He took his place in the dock and gripped the rail in front of him, his knuckles white. The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the public gallery was filled, and more people stood in the aisles and pressed against the walls. They had come to see the man who had killed a ghost. The judge was Sir John Sylvester, a stern figure with a reputation for harsh sentences. He wore the traditional robes and wig of his office, the white horsehair cascading down over his shoulders. The scarlet robes trimmed with ermine. He looked down at Smith from his elevated position, and his face showed nothing, no sympathy, no prejudgment, only the cold neutrality of the law. The clerk read the indictment. Francis Smith was charged with the willful murder of Thomas Millwood, that on the night of January the 3rd he had discharged a pistol at the said Thomas Millwood, inflicting a mortal wound from which Millwood had died approximately 1 hour later. The charge was murder. The penalty was death. Smith was asked how he pleaded. His voice barely audible, he said, "Not guilty." The prosecution was led by a barrister named James Knapp, a heavy-set man with a booming voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. He opened his case with a statement designed to establish the basic facts beyond dispute. A young man was dead. The prisoner had admitted to shooting him. The weapon had been recovered at the scene. There was no question about who had pulled the trigger. The only question was whether the killing was justified, and Knapp intended to prove that it was not. He called his first witness. William Feltham, the constable who had arrested Smith, took the stand. He described arriving at Black Lion Lane shortly after the shooting, finding Smith kneeling beside the body, the pistol lying in the mud nearby. Smith had immediately admitted to firing the shot. He had claimed he thought the victim was a ghost. Feltham testified that Millwood had been wearing the white work clothes of a plasterer, that he had been carrying tools in a bucket, that there was nothing supernatural about his appearance. When asked if Smith had seemed intoxicated or deranged, Feltham said no. Smith had been coherent, rational, capable of answering questions. He had simply made a terrible mistake. The next witness was the surgeon, William Lynn, who described the wound and the cause of death. The ball had entered the chest and passed through the lung. Death had resulted from internal bleeding and respiratory failure. There was nothing unusual about the injury. It was the sort of wound one would expect from a pistol fired at close range. Lynn estimated the distance at 10 to 15 feet based on the powder burns on Millwood's clothing. When asked if there was any possibility Millwood could have survived with medical treatment, Lynn shook his head. The wound was mortal from the moment it was inflicted. The prosecution then called several witnesses who had seen the immediate aftermath. John Locke, the turnpike keeper who had been part of the patrol, testified that Smith had seemed terrified when he arrived at the scene. Smith had said repeatedly that he thought that the figure was the ghost, that he had given warnings, that the figure had not stopped. Elizabeth Turner, a woman who lived on Black Lion Lane, said she had heard Smith shouting before the shot was fired. She could not make out the exact words, but the tone had been one of fear and command. She had looked out her window after the shot and seen Smith standing over the body. Another witness, a labourer named James Cooper, said he had seen a figure in white walking up Black Lion Lane shortly before the shooting. He had assumed it was a workman coming home late. It had not occurred to him that anyone would mistake such a figure for a ghost. Then the prosecution made its critical argument. Knapp stood before the jury and spoke in measured tones about the nature of justifiable homicide. The law recognised certain circumstances in which killing another person was not murder. Self-defence was one. If a man was attacked and killed his attacker to save his own life, that was justifiable. But the threat had to be real and immediate. A reasonable person had to believe their life was in danger. Knapp argued that no reasonable person would believe their life was threatened by someone walking toward them on a public road. Smith had not been attacked. He had not been threatened. He had simply been frightened. And fear alone, Knapp said, was not sufficient justification for taking a life. If every man could shoot anyone who frightened him, if terror was a defence for murder, then no one would be safe. The law required more than fear. It required actual danger. And there had been no danger, only a tired workman walking home in the fog. The defence was led by a barrister named Charles Phillips, a younger man known for his theatrical style and emotional appeals. He rose to present his case knowing that the facts were against him. His client had killed an unarmed man who posed no actual threat, but Phillips believed he could win an acquittal by making the jury understand the context, the atmosphere of terror that had gripped Hammersmith for 3 months. He called his first witness. Thomas Groom, the blacksmith who had encountered the ghost near King Street, described his experience in vivid detail. He spoke of the figure's unnatural height, its gliding movement, the hollow eyes that seemed to look through him rather than at him. He described the cold that had accompanied the apparition, a cold that went beyond weather, that seemed to come from the figure itself. When he finished, several members of the jury were leaning forward, their faces intent. Phillips asked him directly, "Do you believe what you saw was a ghost?" Groom hesitated, then nodded. "I do," he said quietly. "I believe it was something that should not walk this earth." Phillips called witness after witness, each one describing their encounter with the ghost. Anne Porter, who had seen the figure on the common and fainted. William Ford, who had driven his cart past it and felt his horse rear in terror. Mary Green, the seamstress who had seen it 3 times and refused to leave her house afterward. The testimony accumulated, building a picture of a parish in the grip of genuine supernatural terror. These were not fanciful people. They were workers and tradesmen, practical individuals who did not believe in fairy tales. And yet they all swore they had seen something that could not be explained by natural means. Phillips then called Henry Wall, the butcher who had organised the patrols. Wall testified that the patrol had been formed out of desperation, that the constables had been unable or unwilling to address the problem, that men had felt they had no choice but to protect their own families. When asked if the patrol members had expected to encounter something dangerous, Wall said yes. They had expected to face either a criminal using the ghost disguise to hide his activities, or something worse. They had armed themselves accordingly. It had been understood that anyone participating in the patrol might need to use force. Finally, Phillips called Francis Smith himself to the stand. This was unusual. Defendants in criminal trials were not required to testify, and often did not, as their words could be twisted by a skilled prosecutor. But Phillips needed the jury to hear Smith's story in his own voice, to see him not as a murderer, but as an ordinary man pushed beyond his limits by extraordinary circumstances. Smith walked to the witness box slowly, his legs unsteady. He placed one hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Then he sat and faced the courtroom. Phillips guided him through his testimony with careful questions. Smith described his work as an excise officer, his marriage, his reputation as a sober and law-abiding citizen. He explained why he had joined the patrol, his desire to help restore order to the parish, to make it safe for his wife and neighbours. He described taking his position in Black Lion Lane, waiting in the cold and fog, watching for the ghost that had terrorised the community for months. And then he described seeing the figure approach, the white shape emerging from the darkness, moving toward him with that slow, inexorable pace. His voice broke as he spoke about calling out, warning the figure to stop, receiving no response. He described the terror that had gripped him, the absolute certainty that he was facing something supernatural. He had fired to protect himself, he said. He had fired because he believed his life was in danger. And when he saw that it was a man, when he realised what he had done, he had been filled with horror and remorse. He wept openly as he spoke. Several members of the jury looked away, uncomfortable with the display of emotion. Others watched him intently, perhaps trying to determine if the tears were genuine or performed. The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal. Knapp stood before Smith and asked a series of simple questions, each one designed to expose the weakness in his defence. Had Smith seen the figure do anything threatening? No. Had the figure raised a weapon? No. Had the figure even raised its hands in a hostile manner? No. It had simply been walking. Walking toward him, Smith insisted. Walking as if it intended harm. But Knapp pressed the point. How could Smith know the figure's intentions? How could he read malice into simple movement? And why had he fired after giving warnings? Why not fire a warning shot into the air? Why not fire at the ground? Why aim directly at the figure if he was so uncertain what it was? Smith had no good answers. He stammered, repeated himself, said again that he had been frightened, that the figure had not stopped despite his warnings. But Knapp would not let him retreat into emotion. The prosecutor forced him to confront the central fact. He had killed a man for walking, for wearing white clothes, for failing to respond to shouted commands in the fog, and no matter how frightened Smith had been, no matter how convinced he was that he faced something supernatural, the result was the same. Thomas Millwood was dead. And Francis Smith had killed him. The closing arguments began late in the afternoon. Knapp spoke first, reminding the jury that murder was murder regardless of the killer's state of mind. The law did not excuse killing based on fear or confusion. It required actual danger, actual threat. And there had been none. Millwood had been unarmed, unthreatening, simply trying to get home. His only crime had been wearing the wrong clothes at the wrong time. To acquit Smith, Knapp said, would be to say that anyone could kill anyone else simply by claiming they were afraid. It would make a mockery of justice the jury had to convict. Phillips spoke last, and he poured everything he had into his closing. He painted a picture of a community under siege, terrorised by something they could not understand or fight. He reminded the jury of the witnesses who had described the ghost, of the atmosphere of fear that had pervaded Hammersmith for months. He argued that Smith had acted reasonably under the circumstances, that any man in his position would have done the same. To convict Smith would be to punish him for trying to protect his community. It would be to say that courage was a crime. The jury had to understand that this was not a simple case of murder. This was a tragedy born of extraordinary circumstances. Smith deserved mercy, not the rope. Judge Sylvester gave his instructions to the jury as the winter light faded outside the courtroom windows. He explained the law of murder and manslaughter, the difference between justifiable and criminal homicide. He noted that fear alone was not sufficient justification for killing unless that fear was reasonable and the danger was real. He told the jury they must decide whether a reasonable person in Smith's position would have believed their life was in danger. If yes, they could acquit. If no, they must convict. The decision was theirs. The jury retired to deliberate. The courtroom remained full, spectators waiting to hear the verdict, unwilling to leave even to eat or stretch their legs. Smith was led back to a holding cell beneath the courthouse. He sat on a wooden bench in the darkness and waited. An hour passed, then 2. Night fell. Lamps were lit in the courtroom above. Still the jury deliberated. The length of their deliberation was a good sign, Phillips had told Smith when he visited the cell. It meant they were taking the case seriously, considering all the evidence. A quick verdict would have meant conviction. The longer they took, the better the chance of acquittal. Finally, after nearly 4 hours, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. Smith was brought back into the courtroom. The lamps had been lit along the walls, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the spectators. The jury filed back into their box, their expressions grave. The foreman stood when asked if they had reached a verdict. He said they had. The clerk asked what they found. The foreman looked at Smith for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice clear in the silent room. "We find the defendant guilty of murder." The courtroom erupted. Some spectators cried out in anger. Others nodded in grim satisfaction. Smith swayed in the dock, his face going pale. Phillips put his head in his hands. Judge Sylvester called for order, his voice cutting through the noise. When silence finally returned, he looked down at Smith. The sentence for murder was fixed by law. There was no discretion, no room for mercy. Sylvester pronounced the words that had been spoken in that courtroom countless times before, words that meant death. "Francis Smith, you have been found guilty of murder by a jury of your peers. The sentence of this court is that you be taken from this place to a place of lawful execution, and there be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and may God have mercy upon your soul." Smith made no sound. He simply stood gripping the rail, his eyes closed, as the guards moved forward to take him away. The trial was over. Justice, such as it was, had been served, and in 3 weeks' time Francis Smith would climb the scaffold at Newgate Prison and pay for his mistake with his life. Chapter 9. The Verdict and the Rope. The cell in Newgate Prison was 8 feet by 6 feet, with walls of stone so thick that no sound from the outside world penetrated. A narrow window high up near the ceiling allowed in a pale rectangle of daylight during the day, but at night the darkness was absolute. Francis Smith sat on the wooden plank that served as a bed, his back against the cold wall, and counted the hours until his death. The execution had been scheduled for the 1st of February, 3 weeks after the trial. In the Georgian era, condemned prisoners were not kept waiting long. Justice moved swiftly once the verdict was delivered. Smith had been moved to the condemned cell immediately after sentencing, separated from the general prison population, placed in a space reserved for those who would not be leaving Newgate alive. The cell smelled of dampness and old fear, the accumulated terror of everyone who had spent their final days within these walls. A small table held a Bible, a candle, and a cup of water. The prison chaplain visited daily, urging Smith to make his peace with God, to confess his sins and seek forgiveness before facing judgment. Smith listened politely but said little. He had already confessed everything. He had told the truth at his trial. There was nothing left to say. His wife visited when she was permitted. She came in the afternoons, escorted by a guard who waited just outside the cell door, close enough to hear every word, but far enough to provide an illusion of privacy. She brought him food, better than the prison fare, though Smith could barely eat. She held his hands through the bars and wept, and he tried to comfort her, even though he was the one condemned to die. They spoke about practical matters. about the house, about debts that needed to be settled, about where she would go after he was gone. She would return to her family, she said. Her father would take her in. She would survive. But her eyes told a different story. She would carry this for the rest of her life, the knowledge that her husband had died on the gallows, that his name would be remembered only as a murderer. The case had become a sensation in London. The newspapers covered every detail, from the trial testimony to the conditions of Smith's imprisonment to speculation about whether he would show courage on the scaffold. Pamphlets continued to appear, some sympathetic to Smith, portraying him as a victim of circumstances, others condemning him as a killer who deserved his fate. The question of the ghost remained a topic of heated debate. Some writers argued that the haunting had been mass hysteria, that there had never been anything supernatural in Hammersmith, only fear and darkness and the human tendency to see patterns where none existed. Others insisted the ghost had been real, that Millwood's death had been a tragic collision between the natural and supernatural worlds. A few suggested that Smith should be pardoned, that he had acted in good faith based on genuine belief that his life was in danger. A petition for clemency was organised by Charles Phillips, Smith's defence counsel, and by members of the Hammersmith community who believed the sentence was too harsh. They gathered signatures, hundreds of them, from residents who testified to Smith's good character, from witnesses who described the atmosphere of terror that had preceded the shooting, from clergy who argued that mercy was a Christian virtue. The petition was delivered to the Home Secretary, who had the power to recommend a pardon or commutation of sentence to the king. But the Home Secretary declined to intervene. The law had been followed. A jury had convicted. A judge had sentenced. There was no legal basis for clemency. Francis Smith would hang. The condemned man spent his final days in prayer and reflection. The chaplain, a kindly man named Reverend Cotton, visited him every morning and evening reading passages from Scripture, offering what comfort religion could provide to a man facing imminent death. Smith asked questions about the afterlife, about whether he would be judged again by God, about whether his sin could be forgiven. Cotton assured him that God's mercy was infinite, that true repentance could wash away any transgression. But Smith was not convinced. He had killed a man. He had taken a life. No amount of prayer could bring Thomas Millwood back. And if there was justice in the universe, if there was any meaning to moral law, then perhaps he deserved to die. He wrote letters during those final days using the paper and ink provided by the prison. He wrote to his wife a long and rambling letter in which he tried to explain his love for her, his regret for the pain he had caused, his hope that she would find happiness after he was gone. He wrote to his parents, who lived in the countryside and had travelled to London when they heard of his arrest. He asked their forgiveness. He told them he had tried to be a good son. He wrote to the Millwood family, though he did not know if they would read it or burn it unopened. He expressed his profound sorrow for what he had done. He said he would carry Thomas Millwood's face with him to the grave and beyond. He signed it with a shaking hand and gave it to the chaplain to deliver. The newspapers reported that Smith remained calm as the execution date approached. He ate little and slept poorly, but he did not rave or weep or beg for mercy. He accepted his fate with a kind of resigned dignity that the reporters found either admirable or disturbing depending on their perspective. Some wrote that he was a model prisoner, facing death with courage. Others suggested his calm was evidence of a cold heart, that a truly remorseful man would be more obviously broken. The truth was that Smith had moved beyond emotion into a place of numb acceptance. He was going to die. Nothing he said or did could change that. All that remained was to walk the final steps with as much dignity as he could muster. The night before the execution, Smith did not sleep. He sat on his plank bed with the candle burning low, staring at the small flame, thinking about his life. 29 years. Not a long life, but perhaps not a wasted one. He had worked honestly. He had loved his wife. He had tried to be a decent man. And then, in one moment of fear and confusion, he had destroyed everything. He thought about the figure in the fog, the white shape that had seemed so threatening, so certain to be the ghost everyone feared. Even now, knowing what he knew, he could not shake the memory of how it had felt in that moment. The terror had been real. The conviction that he faced something supernatural had been absolute. Did that excuse what he had done? Did it mitigate his guilt? Or was he simply a coward who had killed an innocent man because he was too frightened to think clearly? Dawn came cold and grey. The execution was scheduled for 8 in the morning. Smith was awakened by the chaplain, who led him in a final prayer. Then the guards came to prepare him. His hands were bound behind his back with rope. A hood was placed over his head, though it would not be pulled down over his face until he stood on the scaffold. He was led out of the cell and through the corridors of Newgate, his footsteps echoing on stone, the sounds of the prison waking around him. Other prisoners called out as he passed, some offering prayers, others shouting curses or crude jokes. Smith heard none of it. He was somewhere beyond hearing now, walking in a kind of dream. The scaffold had been erected in the yard outside Newgate Prison, a wooden platform raised 10 feet above the ground with a beam extending across the top and a rope hanging from it. The rope was thick hemp, tied in the traditional hangman's knot, a loop that would tighten around the neck when the body dropped. A crowd had gathered despite the early hour, perhaps 200 people pressed against the barriers that kept them back from the scaffold. Some had come out of morbid curiosity. Others had come because they knew Smith or knew of him, because they wanted to witness the end of the story that had captivated London for weeks. A few had come hoping to see him break, to see him weep and beg, to confirm their belief that all criminals were cowards at heart. Smith was led up the steps to the platform. The chaplain walked beside him, still murmuring to prayers. At the top, Smith was positioned on the trapdoor, the section of the platform that would drop away when the lever was pulled. The hangman, a hooded figure who had performed this duty countless times, placed the noose around Smith's neck and tightened it. The rough rope scratched against Smith's skin. He could feel his pulse beating against it, fast and hard. The hood was pulled down over his face, blocking out the world. He stood in darkness, feeling the morning cold, hearing the murmur of the crowd below. The chaplain asked if he had any final words. Smith's voice was barely audible when he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry for what I did. I pray God will forgive me." Then silence. The hangman stepped back. The chaplain nodded to the prison official, who stood with one hand on the lever that would release the trapdoor. There was a moment of terrible stillness, the world holding its breath. Then the lever was pulled. The trapdoor fell away. Smith dropped through the opening. The rope snapped taut with a sound like a gunshot. His body jerked once, convulsed, then hung motionless. The crowd made a collective sound, half gasp, half sigh. Some turned away, others stared, transfixed. The body turned slowly on the rope, swaying slightly in the cold morning air. The hangman waited, counting silently, making sure the job was done. After 15 minutes, a physician climbed the scaffold and checked for a pulse. He found none. Francis Smith was dead. The body was left hanging for the prescribed hour, a public display meant to deter others from crime. Then it was cut down and placed in a plain wooden coffin. According to law, the bodies of executed murderers were supposed to be dissected for anatomical study or hung in chains as a further deterrent. But Smith's family had petitioned for his body to be released for burial, and the authorities, perhaps feeling that enough suffering had been inflicted, agreed. The coffin was taken to a churchyard in Hammersmith, not far from where Thomas Millwood had been buried weeks earlier. Francis Smith was laid to rest in unconsecrated ground, in the section reserved for suicides and criminals, those deemed unworthy of burial among the righteous. A small stone marked the spot, carved with his name and the year of his death, nothing more. The execution did not bring peace to Hammersmith. The parish remained divided between those who believed Smith had gotten what he deserved, and those who felt he had been unjustly punished for an honest mistake born of extraordinary circumstances. The Millwood family mourned their son and brother, and their grief was compounded by the knowledge that his death had been meaningless, an accident that should never have happened. Smith's wife left London and returned to her family, and she never remarried. She lived quietly for the rest of her life, and she never spoke of her husband except to say that he had been a good man who made a terrible mistake. And the ghost? The sighting stopped after Millwood's death. The white figure never appeared again in the lanes of Hammersmith. Whether this was because the haunting had been Millwood all along, or because whatever had been walking those streets decided to depart, or simply because people stopped looking for it, no one could say. The parish slowly returned to normal. The fear faded. Life continued. But the memory remained, passed down through generations, the story of the Hammersmith ghost and the man who died hunting it, and the man who died because he was mistaken for it. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of fear, about what happens when panic overrides reason, about the terrible consequences of seeing monsters where there are only men. Chapter 10. The Ghost That Remained. The spring of 1804 came late to Hammersmith. The frost lingered on the rooftops through February and into March. The Thames ran cold and grey, carrying ice from upstream that scraped against the pilings of the docks. The trees remained bare longer than usual, their black branches reaching into a colourless sky like the fingers of drowned men. The parish slowly emerged from winter, but the shadow of what had happened in January did not lift with the warming weather. Some shadows, once cast, remained long after their sources vanished. Black Lion Lane became a place people avoided. There was no practical reason for this. The lane served the same function it always had, connecting King Street to the river, providing access to the houses and workshops along its length. But people found alternate routes when they could. They walked the long way around. They muttered excuses about needing to stop somewhere else first. The spot where Thomas Millwood had fallen was marked by nothing visible. No monument or memorial, but everyone who lived nearby knew exactly where it was. Some said they felt a coldness when they passed, even on warm days. Others claimed they heard sounds at night, a voice calling out, footsteps that stopped suddenly. These claims were dismissed as imagination, as the lingering effects of fear, but they persisted nonetheless. The house where Millwood had died, where he had been carried after being shot and had breathed his last on a stranger's table, stood empty for months. The family who lived there moved out within weeks of the incident. They said they could not bear to stay, could not sleep in rooms where a man had bled to death, could not forget the sound of his laboured breathing in those final minutes. The landlord tried to rent it to others, but there were no takers. The house developed a reputation. People said it was haunted, that Millwood's spirit walked its rooms, that lights could be seen in the windows late at night when no one was supposed to be inside. Eventually the landlord sold it at a loss, and the new owner let it sit vacant rather than deal with the stigma attached to it. The churchyard of St. Paul's, where the ghost had been seen so many times during those 3 months of terror, became a lonely place. Funerals were still held there, of course. The dead still had to be buried. But the evening visitors stopped coming. The old men who used to sit on the benches smoking their pipes found other places to gather. Mothers kept their children away. The churchyard had always been a liminal space, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner than elsewhere, but now it felt actively dangerous, as if something malevolent had taken root among the graves. The vicar, Reverend Bennett, tried to consecrate the ground again to perform rituals of cleansing and blessing, but the reputation persisted. The churchyard became a place of whispers and avoidance. The question of what had truly happened during those months of sightings was never resolved. The official position, the one articulated by magistrates and constables and newspaper editors, was that there had been no ghost. The sightings had been a combination of Thomas Millwood walking home in his work clothes and mass hysteria, amplifying normal events into supernatural ones. This explanation satisfied those who needed the world to make rational sense, who could not accept the possibility that the dead might walk. But it satisfied no one who had actually seen the figure, because the descriptions did not match Millwood. The hollow eyes, the gliding movement, the sense of dread that accompanied it, and most importantly, the timing. The ghost had been seen multiple times on nights when Millwood was documented to have been elsewhere, working on sites far from Hammersmith, or at home with his family. The official explanation required believing that dozens of witnesses were all mistaken, that they had all imagined details that happened to align with one another, that 3 months of consistent sightings could be reduced to coincidence and delusion. Some residents, the ones who had encountered the figure directly, maintained until the end of their lives that they had seen something genuine. Thomas Groome, the blacksmith who had come face to face with the ghost near King Street, never wavered in his account. He described it in the same terms 30 years later that he had used in his trial testimony. Tall, draped in white, with eyes that looked through rather than at him, accompanied by a cold that had nothing to do with weather. Anne Porter, who had fainted on the common, moved away from Hammersmith within a year, but wrote letters to friends describing her encounter in detail. She said she knew the difference between a man in a costume and something that should not exist. What she had seen was the latter. Mary Green, the seamstress who had seen the figure 3 times, died in 1812, still insisting that Hammersmith had been genuinely haunted, that whatever walked those lanes had been no living person. There were theories, of course. There always are when events defy easy explanation. Some suggested that the ghost had been the spirit of someone who died violently in Hammersmith decades or centuries earlier, someone whose death had gone unavenged or whose body had been improperly buried. They pointed to parish records showing a hanging that had taken place near Black Lion Lane in 1760. A man executed for highway robbery and left to rot in an iron cage as a warning to others. Perhaps his spirit had been restless, bound to the place of his death, walking the lanes in search of peace or justice, or simply unable to move on. Others proposed that the haunting had been demonic, a manifestation of evil drawn to Hammersmith by some sin or weakness in the community. The fear itself might have opened a door, allowing something dark to enter the world of the living. These theories were dismissed by the educated and the sceptical, but they circulated nonetheless, whispered in taverns and markets, passed from generation to generation as explanations for what the official version could not account for. A different theory, one that gained credence among those who thought about such things carefully, was that there had indeed been someone deliberately playing the ghost, but that this person had not been Thomas Millwood. Someone had been walking the lanes in white garments, frightening people, creating the atmosphere of terror. That person had stopped appearing after Millwood's death, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of, fear of being caught, perhaps simply because the game had turned deadly and was no longer amusing. Millwood had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, wearing clothes that matched the description of the figure everyone was looking for, and Francis Smith had made the fatal mistake of assuming he had found his quarry. This theory had the virtue of explaining both the genuine sightings and Millwood's innocence, but it required accepting that someone in Hammersmith had been cruel enough to terrorise their neighbours for months, and had then gotten away with it, living quietly among the people they had tormented, while an innocent man died for their actions. If such a person existed, they were never identified. No deathbed confession ever emerged, no evidence ever came to light. And so the mystery remained, suspended in the amber of history, a question without an answer. What had the people of Hammersmith really seen during the autumn and winter of 1803? Had it been a ghost, a spirit, something that should not exist but somehow did? Had it been a cruel prankster whose identity died with them? Had it been nothing more than shadows and fog and fear turning ordinary sights into supernatural visions? Or had it been all of these things at once, a perfect storm of circumstances in which the natural and supernatural, the real and the imagined, the malicious and the accidental all combined to create a tragedy that no single explanation could encompass? The story became folklore. It was told in alehouses and around fires, embellished and altered with each telling. Children grew up hearing about the Hammersmith ghost, about the man who had been shot while walking home, about the hunter who became a murderer. The details shifted over time. In some versions, Millwood became a hero, a martyr sacrificed to the panic of his age. In others, Smith became a villain, a trigger-happy fool who killed without thinking. The ghost itself grew larger in memory, more terrifying, more clearly supernatural, until it bore little resemblance to the accounts given by actual witnesses. But beneath the embellishments, the core facts remained. Something had happened in Hammersmith. People had been genuinely frightened, and 2 men had died as a result. The case had legal repercussions that extended beyond the immediate tragedy. It became a precedent in discussions of criminal intent and reasonable fear. Law students studied it in the decades that followed, debating whether Smith's conviction had been just, whether the law adequately accounted for genuine but mistaken belief in danger. Some argued that the verdict was correct, that killing based on fear of the supernatural could never be justified, because supernatural threats were not real. Others contended that the law should account for the subjective experience of the defendant, that if Smith genuinely believed his life was in danger, his actions should be judged differently than if he had killed knowing the figure was harmless. The debate continued long after everyone involved in the actual events had died. The Hammersmith ghost entered the literature of the paranormal. It was included in collections of true ghost stories, in compendiums of unexplained phenomena, in books about the history of hauntings in London. Writers and researchers returned to it again and again, trying to solve the mystery, trying to determine what had really happened. Some conducted their own investigations, interviewing descendants of witnesses, searching parish records for clues, walking the lanes where the sightings had occurred. None found definitive answers. The ghost remained elusive, present in testimony and memory, but absent from physical evidence, a story that resisted resolution. By the end of the 19th century, Hammersmith had changed. The parish had grown, expanded, been absorbed into the greater sprawl of London. The lanes where the ghost had walked were paved over. The houses where witnesses had lived were torn down and replaced. The churchyard of St. Paul's was still there, but surrounded now by newer buildings, hemmed in by progress. Black Lion Lane remained, though it looked nothing like it had in 1804. The mud and cobblestones had been replaced by modern pavement. Street lamps lit it at night, driving away the shadows where a figure in white had once appeared. The people who walked it had no memory of the events that had transpired there, no knowledge that this ordinary street had once been the stage for tragedy. But memory persists in strange ways. Local historians kept the story alive. Plaques were eventually erected, small markers noting the approximate locations where Millwood had fallen and where Smith had stood. Ghost tours began to include Hammersmith in their routes, guides telling sanitized versions of the tale to tourists who shivered with manufactured fear and took photographs of empty lanes. The story became entertainment, a curiosity, a bit of historical oddity to be consumed and forgotten. But for those who looked deeper, who read the trial transcripts and the witness statements, who traced the outlines of lives destroyed by fear and confusion, the story remained what it had always been, a tragedy. A reminder of how quickly the familiar can become terrifying, how easily reason can be overwhelmed by panic, how the line between victim and killer can be crossed in a single moment of poor judgment. And what of the ghost itself? Did it ever truly exist? Or was it always a phantom of a different kind? A projection of human fear onto the darkness? A story that grew in the telling until it became more real than reality? Perhaps the answer does not matter. What matters is what happened, the concrete facts that cannot be disputed. Thomas Millwood died in a cold lane far from home. Francis Smith died on a scaffold, paying with his life for a moment of terror. 2 families were destroyed, a community was scarred, and somewhere in the space between fact and folklore, between history and myth, the Hammersmith ghost walks still, not in the lanes of modern London, but in the stories we tell about what happens when fear takes hold and will not let go. The night is quiet now, the tale is told. Somewhere beyond your window, the world continues its turning, indifferent to the tragedies of the past, to the lives that were lost, to the questions that remain unanswered. But perhaps, as you drift towards sleep, you will remember this story. Perhaps you will think about the figure in white, about the man who hunted it and the man who was mistaken for it. Perhaps you will wonder, as people have wondered for more than 2 centuries, what truly walked the lanes of Hammersmith in those cold months of fear. And perhaps, just perhaps, You will hear a sound outside your window, a footstep on the path, and you will pause and listen and wonder whether the boundary between the living and the dead is as solid as you have always believed. Sleep well, and remember, not all ghosts are spirits of the dead. Some are born from fear itself, given form by belief, sustained by the stories we cannot stop telling. The Hammersmith ghost may be gone, but the fear that created it, that lives in the dark corners of every human heart, that turns strangers into threats and shadows into monsters, that fear walks still, and it always will. The candle burns low, the chamber falls silent, and history once again closes the book in the dark.